Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Interrelations of Grassroots Processes with Policy Interventions on the part of the governments, international development agencies and NGOs from population, urbanization and poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the types, roles and downsides of NGOs. The main objectives of this module are to understand the concept of NGOs, various types of NGOs, the role of NGOs, the downsides of NGOs, the interrelationship among governments, international agencies and the NGOs. Taken literally, a non-government organization could describe just about anything from social groups to for non-profit firms. Going by the World Bank's definition, we can define NGOs as private organizations characterized primarily by humanitarian or cooperative rather than commercial objectives that pursue activities to relieve suffering, promote the interest of the poor, protect the environment, provide basic social services, or undertake community development in developing countries. From this perspective, NGOs are frequently idealized as organizations committed to doing good while setting aside profit or politics. The term NGO is thus usually applied to any non-profit organizations which is independent from government. NGOs are thus identified as value-based organizations which depend in whole or in part on charitable donations and voluntary service. Although the NGO sector has become increasingly professionalized during the last 3 decades, principles of altruism and voluntarism remain key defining characteristics. Recently, NGOs have been characterized as the new favored child of official development agencies and proclaimed as a magic bullet to target and fix the problems that have befallen the development process. They are seen as instrumental in changing mindsets and attitudes in addition to being more efficient providers of goods and services. NGOs' involvement in delivery of services to the marginalized sections of the societies is always considered to be desirable because these organizations are supposed to counter the inefficiencies of government and address the harsh effects of economic policies. Although there are indications that the enthusiasm and interest in NGOs is decreasing, yet they remain the preferred recipients and implementers of development assistance from international donor community. These NGOs, through direct programs or through the governments, always access funding for the poor. It is generally believed that the NGOs fill the gaps created by existing government policies. They work where the government fails. The macroeconomic policies have a broader view about the society and may ignore the practical problems in their implementation due to the structural bottlenecks which differ in their character from place to place. Since the NGOs work at the grassroots level, they are considered to be more efficient and effective. They are innovative, flexible, independent, and responsive to the problems of poor people at the grassroots level. The growth of such NGOs over the past 2 decades has given them an increasingly important role and has led them forming a distinctive sector within civil society. They have been engaged in all sectors of social life, such as relief, rehabilitation, health, education, development programs, peace, human rights, and environmental issues, using finance raised from voluntary, private sources and donor agencies, and managing themselves autonomously at local, national, and international levels. However, the critics may also attack the motives, the contribution, and the independent status of the NGOs. They say that NGOs are only a weak link between the policymakers and the society. They are just a reflection of government's unwillingness to achieve the set targets. They are never financially independent and often follow the government agenda for getting easy flow of funds. Moreover, whatever they do is highly localized, and therefore their contribution in overall goals is very insignificant. Therefore, they cannot be substituted for the national and centralized policies. Despite all this criticism, the growth of NGOs over the past 2 decades is quite noticeable. Therefore, it is important here to find the interrelationships among the governments, international agencies, and the NGOs for achieving common targets. In this direction, first of all, it is important to know about the types of NGOs. According to the World Bank Operational Manual on Non-Governmental Organizations in GP 14.70 or Good Practice Statement, the NGOs can be broadly divided into two main categories. Number one, the operational NGOs, whose primary purpose is to fund, design, or implement development-related programs or projects. This NGO type, by level of cooperation, can be grouped into community-based organizations, city-wide organizations, grassroots level organizations, national and international organizations. The community-based organizations arise out of people's own initiatives. They work to help people in understanding their rights, accessing needed services, and in providing these services at the local level. On the other hand, the grassroots level organizations are specialized subsets of intermediate governmental organizations that provide services, allied support to local groups of disadvantaged rural or urban households and individuals. Thus, these organizations forge a link between beneficiary and the often remote levels of governments, donor, and financial institutions, and are helpful in enhancing the capacity of impoverished communities and in building sustainable alternatives to their challenging life conditions. The second type of NGOs is advocacy NGOs. The advocacy NGOs are those NGOs whose primary purpose is to defend or promote a specific development cause and which seek to influence the development policies and practices of international development agencies, governments, and other bodies. The motives or action may be political, religious, or commercial to achieve their aims. These groups may use a number of methods such as lobbying, media campaigns, opinion polls, research, and policy briefings. The difference between these two groups of NGOs is not rigid, however. While some NGOs concentrate on relief and service delivery and have virtually no analytical or policy function, and some are lobbying NGOs with no operational base. The majority falls somewhere between these extremes. Operational NGOs usually have more field level experience that is relevant to the national governments as well as international development agencies, but advocacy groups may also be able to offer valuable grassroots insight and challenge the conventional development thinking. Now let us discuss about the role of the NGOs. The growing popularity of NGOs in the development field seems to be strictly associated with the emergence in the last 20 years of a so-called new policy agenda, which has deeply influenced both bilateral and multilateral actors. Is the idea that private sector initiatives are intrinsically more efficient than public initiatives, so that private forms of intervention should be seen as the preferred carriers of policies aimed at increasing social welfare. Not only are NGOs regarded as more efficient, innovative, and dynamic than state bureaucracies, they also seen as important for institutionalization of mechanisms of democratic accountability. It is claimed NGOs are more innovative, flexible, and cost-effective than government organizations. Also, NGOs are believed to be especially good at reaching and mobilizing the poor in remote rural communities and at adopting participatory processes in project implementation. These participatory procedures empower the recipients. Although there is no unanimity in what is and what should be the role of NGOs, but from the point of view of the grassroots levels interventions by the governments and international agencies through NGOs, the former expect that the NGOs should necessarily be performing two key functions. These functions are: number one, they must be social service providers. NGOs work closely with their governments as partners or contractors, and even independently where the government fails to do so. More and more NGOs in developing countries or countries in transition receive funds from their governments or donors and perform as service providers. Even though NGOs have been providing services independently from government since their beginning, cooperation with government in providing direct services increasingly became more common during the last 2 decades. This is mainly due to the tendency of the governments as well as international institutions to encourage NGOs to engage in service providing for several reasons. In the late 70s and early 80s, conservative governments in Britain and in America and many other countries afterwards reduced the role of government in direct service provision along with the privatization of the public sector. By funding NGOs, national governments as well as the international development agencies are able to spare themselves of many of the nitty-gritty works of service provision. Instead, they simply direct, regulate, and overlook NGOs' performance. Another reason is a strategic one. It seems that NGOs are to some extent seen as a guaranteed way of promoting democracy, civil society, and active citizenship. Due to their commitment to non-profit methods and the spirit of public service, NGOs are considered to be efficient instruments. Activities involving the functioning of service providing are promoting volunteerism, assessing people's needs, inventing new services or ways of provision, delivering services, evaluating results, funding small grassroots organizations, and many more. These may contribute significantly to socio-economic development. Another important role of NGOs is to monitor, criticize, and advocate the social cause. The second most important function of NGOs is that they encourage social change and can protect individual rights by monitoring, criticizing government and market power and influence social and market policies. It seems that this function can cause NGOs to act against government, often rendering NGOs' government relationship rather antagonistic. But this is not always the case. In cases of international or transnational matters, which government cannot address eagerly for some diplomatic reasons, NGOs can make their voices heard without being restricted. NGOs' monitoring role is not restricted only to the government activities. NGOs play as a counterweight to the private sector, or sometimes they may also be advocating the expansion of the private sector. Thus, these roles of NGOs can be intrinsically political. These activities have a direct bearing on social development of civil society. Now, there are certain downsides of NGOs as state actors. The discussion so far shows that NGOs are being propagated as the efficient state actors, and they plug the gaps created by inefficient and inflexible practices used by the government machinery. However, there are equally strong voices of criticism that state and NGOs can never substitute the government actions, and their propagation is just an excuse on part of the government to spare itself from its social responsibility. Here we can discuss a few points of criticism. Firstly, there is no systematic evidence that NGOs are more cost-effective than government institutions. Secondly, the NGOs do not always reach the poorest of the poor. The ones who tend to benefit the most from NGO programs are overwhelmingly not so poor. Thirdly, all the ideology about NGOs is actually based upon lack of systematic comparisons of NGOs and government programs in structurally similar environments. Most evaluations are based upon single case studies of a particular program. There is a study by Anupama which compared two government-promoted and two NGO-initiated community forestry programs in state of Andhra Pradesh, India. The study found that the participants in government programs tended to benefit more than those in non-governmental programs, while the NGO programs, unlike government programs, participants with lower economic status tended to get lower benefits than their counterparts belonging to relatively higher economic status. The critics also raised doubts about the apolitical status of the NGOs. They state that these organizations are actually the new instruments of the word imperialist bodies. The NGOs are accused of being economically and ideologically controlled by Western donors whose funds are conditional on the NGOs following a carefully charted international strategy. However, despite all this criticism, the reality is that in today's world of greater integration and that of having internationally common goals, the role of NGOs is assuming greater importance and significance, and therefore, the national governments as well as international agencies are looking forward for increasing participation of these organizations to speed up at the grassroots processes. Now we can discuss the interrelations among government, international agencies, and the NGOs. There is actually a close relationship among the governments, international agencies, and the NGOs. This is shown in Figure 1. It is being increasingly recognized that none of the trio of governments, international development agencies, and the NGOs or grassroots level bodies alone can fulfill their specific aims. Achieving the micro and macro level goals is thus a collective effort. The scarcity of resources for grassroots development often leads the national governments to increasingly sought partnership with civil society through both profit and non-profit organizations to mobilize additional resources for speedy achievement of specific goals and to provide crucial services to the poor. This is the more conventional form of partnership and the one encouraged during periods of market-led reforms. The civil society organizations are further responsible for mobilizing resources from national as well as international funding agencies who again rely upon these grassroots level organizations for efficient utilization of the resources provided by them. Such relationship encourages partnership and inclusiveness. The avowed benefits that flow from such partnerships at the subnational or decentralized level include greater transparency, reduction of transport cost, and enhanced accountability. Once civil society is capacitated, it is easier to engage the government in a dialogue of what need to be provided for the poor, the mode of service provision, and who will pay for it. Similarly, transaction costs for services are reduced. Local providers of services are believed to be more attuned to local requirements, more accessible to the public, and find it easier to spot areas of cost reduction. However, the skeptics also feel that a lack of suitable negotiating skills and inadequate market conditions may render some of these partnerships less productive and therefore less conducive to development. As a result, weak accountability and transparency, as well as the asymmetrical power of the partners, may lead to short-term opportunistic partnerships of dubious value to the poor segments of community at large. However, the governments can play a pivotal role in fostering an enabling environment. Good partnerships must be based on principles that are value-driven, inclusive, transparent, and accountable. Then, the building of capacities of civil society and government for entering such partnerships without the risk of failure becomes an easier proposition. Hence, civil society empowerment requires more than involvement and inclusion in dialogue with major development partners. The world today witnesses a low level of civil society activism over the past few years. The NGOs and other grassroots level organizations in the developing countries are increasing their engagement with international institutions such as World Bank and Asian Development Bank to influence policies and seeking operational collaboration at the country level. These institutions are also now increasingly relying upon the NGOs for disbursement of the funds. Recently, the World Bank, in its Civil Society Engagement Review of fiscal years 2010 to 2012, acknowledged that the participation of civil society organizations has increased in drafting the country assistance strategies and poverty reduction strategy papers. It showed that during the period 2010 to 12, the civil society organizations participated in 82% of 1,018 new projects and programs financed by the bank. These organizations were also important beneficiaries of community-driven development projects, which received some $4.5 billion in 2012. The bank is now increasingly consulting the civil society organization in framing and implementing the policies, programs, and plans. During 2009 to 2012, the bank held nearly 24 multi-stakeholder consultations at the global level, which include representatives from multilateral and bilateral agencies, private sector, governments, media, and civil society organizations. The civil society organizations alone participated in about 38% of total consultations on variety of issues. The share of civil society organizations in bank-funded projects has been increasing consistently since 1990. This share was merely 22% in the year 1990, which increased to about 82% in 2012. This can be observed from figure 3. The figure shows that the bank financed 385 projects in 2010, another 385 in 2011, and 248 in 2012, or a total of 1018 for 3-year period. Of these, 843, that is 82%, went to the civil society organizations. In developing country context also, Asian Development Bank has recognized the need of the grassroots level organizations in reducing poverty in Asia and Pacific. In its strategy 2020, ADB has emphasized that the partnership with the NGOs or civil society organization is central to all aspects of operation, including planning, financing, and project implementation. The results of ADB's commitment to working with CSOs are clear. In 1990, less than 10% of ADB's work included participation by civil society organizations. Today, more than 91% of ADB projects include civil society organization contributions to design, implementation, or monitoring. This can be observed from figure 4. The increasing importance of the NGOs in international agencies can also be traced through their increasing participation in all ADB operations in last 3 years. ADB operates in 9 sectors and 8 thematic areas. For all projects approved in 2012, civil society organizations' participation rates exceeded those in 2010 and 2011. However, the participation rate for projects in water, public sector management, health and industry, and trade remained the same. With the exception of finance and transport and information and communication technology, civil society organization participation was 100% in nearly all sectors in 2012. Traditionally, civil society organizations' participation is higher in projects involving water supply and other municipal infrastructure and services, energy, agriculture and natural resources, and education. Civil society organizations' participation in public management, health and social protection, industry and trade became more mainstreamed in 2011-12, resulting partly from more numerous staff awareness workshops and more training at headquarters and the resident missions. Civil society organizations' participation in ADB projects has also increased in different themes under which different projects fall. Environmental sustainability, inclusive social development, and gender equality consistently achieved high civil society organizations' participation, with many achieving 100% inclusion. During 2010 to 2012, civil society organizations' participation increased progressively in regional cooperation and integration projects as well as private development. If we look at the regional scenario, the ADB data shows that in 2012, ADB loans to South Asia totaled $3.57 billion for 30 projects and $52.59 million in technical assistance for 68 projects in transport, energy, and public management. Of the total lending, India received $2.02 billion, including $128 million in non-sovereign loans and $64 million from private sector operations. Civil society organizations' participation in the design, implementation, or monitoring and evaluation of ADB-funded project initiatives increased from 58% in 2010 to 70% in 2011. In 2012, a slight decrease to 69% reflected the low percentage of CSO participation in stand-alone technical assistance projects. Participation in loans, grants, and related PPTA projects was higher. During 2010 to 2012, CSO participation in loans and related PPTA projects was higher, which was 97%, 96%, and 100% respectively, as compared to the participation in grants and related PPTA projects, that is 89%, 89%, and 75% respectively. Similar to other regions, stand-alone TA projects in South Asia have lower CSO participation because many of these projects only provide training and are not related to any loan or grant financed projects. So students, let us summarize what we have learned from this module. We have seen that both the national governments and the international development institutions are now seeing NGOs with increasing optimism for fulfilling the macro targets through grassroots processes. It is being felt that the cooperation with NGOs is an effective strategy to supplement efforts in selected operational areas. The NGOs have the ability to enhance the effectiveness of the programs run by national governments and international development agencies, as these NGOs have the special commitment, capabilities, and expertise to work at the grassroots level. With these facts in view, the international agencies, through the national governments, have adopted operational strategy that not only supports integrated growth-oriented development projects, but also supports the projects focused on human development, social development, and environment protection. As a result, the contribution of the NGOs in consultations, participation in conferences of the projects run by the international institutions and national government has increased tremendously during the last 2 decades. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.